When I told my best friend about my cancer diagnosis, she said, "Well, at least you'll finally lose weight." The GoFundMe campaign she'd set up for my cancer treatment had raised $83,000 in 2 weeks, and I was staring at bank statements showing that only $12,000 had actually been transferred to my medical fund, while the rest sat in an account only she could access. My hands went completely numb holding those papers because Melissa Carver, my best friend of 15 years, the woman who'd cried with me when I got the diagnosis and promised to help me through everything, had apparently been stealing money that people had donated specifically for my chemotherapy and surgery. The accountant I'd hired, a meticulous woman named Dorothy Lynn, who'd been practicing forensic accounting for 19 years, had traced every transaction and confirmed what I'd suspected for weeks. Melissa had been systematically siphoning funds while posting tearful updates about my struggle on social media, building her own following as the devoted friend, caring for a dying man, all while the actual medical bills piled up unpaid, and I got sicker. The weight loss comment had been just the beginning, the first crack in a facade I'd been too trusting and too sick to see through until now. I'd been friends with Melissa since college, both of us at the University of Washington in Seattle, and she'd been one of those magnetic people everyone wanted to be around. I'm Adam Kowalski, and I'd met Melissa in a communications class junior year when she'd needed help with statistics, and I'd volunteered to tutor her. We'd clicked immediately, spent hours talking about everything and nothing, and stayed close after graduation, even as our lives diverged. I went into data analysis for a tech company, while Melissa bounced between marketing jobs and side hustles, always chasing the next big thing. She was charismatic and fun, threw great parties, knew everyone, and made you feel like you were the most important person in the room when she focused her attention on you. I'd dated various people over the years, but Melissa had been my constant, my person, the friend I called with good news and bad news, the one I trusted implicitly. The diagnosis came in March 2023, stage 3 colon cancer at 34 years old, which my oncologist Dr. Raymond Pierce said was unfortunately becoming more common in younger adults. Dr. Pierce was in his early 50s, had been practicing oncology at Seattle Cancer Care Alliance for 23 years, and he delivered the news with compassionate directness that I appreciated. He explained I'd need aggressive chemotherapy, possibly radiation, and surgery to remove part of my colon, followed by more chemo. The treatment plan would cost approximately $240,000, even with insurance, between copays and deductibles and the experimental drugs that weren't fully covered. I made decent money as a senior data analyst but didn't have that kind of savings, and the treatment would mean taking extended medical leave, reducing my income further. I was terrified, overwhelmed, and when I called Melissa crying that night, she immediately drove over and held me while I fell apart. Melissa stayed with me that first terrible week, going to doctor appointments, taking notes, asking questions I was too shocked to think of. She was the one who suggested the GoFundMe, said people would want to help, that I shouldn't be too proud to ask for support when fighting cancer. She offered to set it up and manage it since I'd be focused on treatment, and I gratefully accepted. She created a page with photos of me, a heartfelt description of my diagnosis and treatment plan, and specific fundraising goals tied to medical expenses. She shared it across all her social media platforms, reached out to mutual friends and college networks, and the donations started coming in immediately. $20, $50, $100 donations from people I'd known years ago and people I'd never met who were moved by the story. Within days, we'd raised $10,000. Within 2 weeks, over $80,000. I was overwhelmed by the generosity, by people's willingness to help a stranger or a distant acquaintance, and I told Melissa I didn't know what I'd do without her. The weight comment happened about 3 weeks after the diagnosis, right before I started chemo. I'd been nervous about the treatment, scared of the side effects I'd read about, and Melissa came over with dinner and wine to keep me company. I'd mentioned that Dr. Pierce said I'd probably lose weight during treatment due to nausea and appetite loss, and Melissa had laughed and said, "Well, at least you'll finally lose weight. You've been trying to drop those 30 pounds for years." She said it casually, like it was a silver lining, a joke between friends. I'd struggled with my weight since college, had done various diets and exercise programs with limited success, and Melissa knew it was a sensitive topic. But I laughed it off uncomfortably, told myself she was just trying to lighten the mood, that dark humor was her coping mechanism. Looking back, I can see it was the first sign that something was deeply wrong with how she viewed my illness, that she saw my cancer as somehow beneficial or interesting rather than the devastating, life-threatening crisis it actually was. Chemotherapy started in early April, and it was as brutal as I'd feared. The nausea was constant and overwhelming, food tasted like metal, the fatigue was unlike anything I'd experienced. Melissa was there for the first few treatments, driving me to appointments, sitting with me during the infusions, posting updates on social media about how brave I was and how hard she was working to support me through this journey. The updates always featured photos of us together, her looking concerned and caring, me looking progressively sicker. Her follower count started growing, people commenting on what an amazing friend she was, how inspiring our story was. She'd share the GoFundMe link in every update, and donations kept coming in. By the end of April, we'd raised over $115,000, exceeding our initial goal. Melissa told me the money was being transferred to a dedicated medical fund account that she'd set up to keep it separate from my regular accounts, that she was paying bills directly from that fund to make sure everything was organized and documented for tax purposes. I was too sick to question any of it. Between the chemo and the cancer itself, I could barely function. I'd taken medical leave from work, was living off short-term disability payments that covered about 60% of my salary, and was focused entirely on survival. Melissa handled everything related to the fundraising and medical bills, showing me occasional summaries of what had been paid, but never full documentation. She said she was protecting me from stress, that I needed to focus on healing while she handled the logistics. I trusted her completely, was grateful to have someone managing the overwhelming administrative burden of serious illness. She'd bring me soup, help me to appointments, pick up prescriptions, do my laundry. She was performing the role of devoted caregiver perfectly, and I had no reason to doubt her sincerity. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. The first real warning sign came in late May, about 6 weeks into treatment. I received a call from the hospital billing department saying I had an outstanding balance of $38,000 for the first round of chemo and associated care. I was confused because I thought that had been paid from the GoFundMe account. I called Melissa, and she sounded flustered, said there must be a billing error, that she'd paid that invoice weeks ago and would call them to sort it out. She called me back an hour later saying she'd resolved it, that the payment had been processed but hadn't shown up in their system yet. Typical medical billing incompetence. I accepted the explanation because it seemed plausible and because questioning her felt like questioning the one person who was keeping me alive. But the call had planted a seed of doubt that I tried to ignore. Then in early June, my surgeon's office called to schedule the surgery Dr. Pierce had recommended, and they said they needed to collect a $15,000 deposit up front because my insurance required it, and the account showed I hadn't paid previous balances. Again, I was confused and contacted Melissa. Again, she said it was billing errors, that she'd handled everything, that these medical billing systems were notoriously bad at tracking payments. She said she'd call them directly and straighten it out. But this time I asked to see documentation of all the payments she'd made from the GoFundMe account, wanting to verify everything myself. She said, of course, she'd pull together all the records and bring them over that weekend. Saturday came and went without her showing up. Sunday she texted saying she'd gotten food poisoning and couldn't make it, would come by during the week. The week passed with various excuses, and she never brought the documents. I started feeling anxious in ways that had nothing to do with the cancer. Something was wrong, but I couldn't articulate what, and I felt guilty for doubting someone who'd been so supportive. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the chemo was affecting my thinking, that Melissa had been nothing but helpful. But the anxiety persisted, and I decided to do some investigating myself. I logged into the GoFundMe platform to check the campaign status, and found I didn't have admin access. Only Melissa did. The campaign showed it had raised $128,000 as of early June, but I had no way to see where that money had actually gone. I called GoFundMe's support line and spent 40 minutes on hold before reaching someone who explained that funds went to the campaign organizer's linked bank account, and only the organizer could transfer money or provide withdrawal documentation. I explained I was the beneficiary and needed to verify the funds were being used appropriately, and they said I'd need to work directly with Melissa as the organizer or potentially take legal action if I suspected fraud. Legal action. The word made my stomach drop because it implied a level of wrongdoing I wasn't ready to confront. I decided to handle it directly, called Melissa, and asked point blank to see the bank statements for the medical fund account. She got defensive, asked why I was questioning her, said she'd been working tirelessly to help me, and this felt like an insult. I said I wasn't questioning her integrity, just needed to see the records for my own peace of mind and for potential tax purposes. She said fine, she'd pull everything together and bring it by in a few days. 3 days later, she showed up with a folder of papers, printouts of various bills and payment confirmations, but when I looked closely, the documentation was incomplete. The payment confirmations didn't match the amounts on the bills, dates didn't align properly, and several of the documents looked like they'd been edited or created in a word processor rather than being original invoices and receipts. I asked about the discrepancies, and she got angry, said I was being ungrateful, that she'd been sacrificing her time and energy to help me, and this was how I thanked her. The argument was ugly and ended with her leaving in tears, saying she couldn't believe I'd accuse her of anything shady after everything she'd done. I felt awful, guilty for upsetting her, but I also felt certain now that something was very wrong. I contacted an attorney, someone recommended by a college friend, named Catherine Renwick, who specialized in fraud and financial disputes and had been practicing for 16 years. Catherine listened to my story, reviewed the incomplete documentation Melissa had provided, and said this looked like potential embezzlement or fraud, and I should take immediate steps to protect myself. She recommended hiring a forensic accountant to trace the money, filing a police report if the investigation confirmed theft, and potentially freezing the GoFundMe campaign to prevent further unauthorized withdrawals. She quoted a retainer of $8,000 for her services, money I barely had given my medical expenses, but I authorized it because I needed to know the truth. Catherine connected me with Dorothy Lynn, the forensic accountant, who started investigating immediately. Dorothy requested full bank records from Melissa through a formal legal demand, and when Melissa refused, Catherine got a court order compelling production of documents. The records that came back were devastating. Dorothy traced every dollar that had come into the account Melissa controlled from the GoFundMe campaign and found that of the $128,000 raised, only $12,000 had actually been transferred to pay my medical bills. The rest had been withdrawn in cash, transferred to Melissa's personal accounts, or spent on personal expenses, designer clothes, restaurant meals, a vacation to Mexico, rent payments on her apartment. She'd been stealing from the cancer fund while posting emotional updates about my treatment and soliciting more donations. The fraud was systematic, deliberate, and ongoing. Dorothy's report was comprehensive, showing transaction dates, amounts, receiving accounts, and even screenshots of Melissa's social media posts, timed to coincide with major withdrawals. On the same day, she'd posted a tearful video about how the chemo was making me so sick and please donate to help with experimental treatments. She'd withdrawn $8,000 and used it to buy a designer handbag. The pattern was clear. She'd use my suffering to generate donations and sympathy, then steal the money for her own benefit while providing just enough actual support to maintain the appearance of being helpful. It was calculated exploitation of my illness and people's generosity, and it had been going on for 3 months. The total amount stolen was approximately $116,000, money that was supposed to be saving my life, but instead had funded her lifestyle upgrade. I felt physically sick reading Dorothy's report, and not from the chemo. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that it redefined my understanding of who Melissa was. This wasn't a misunderstanding or poor judgment. This was fraud, committed against someone she called her best friend, someone who was literally fighting for his life. Catherine said we had overwhelming evidence for both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit that Melissa had committed wire fraud, theft, and potentially other crimes depending on how the prosecutor wanted to charge it. She recommended I file a police report immediately and let the criminal justice system handle prosecution while we pursued civil recovery of the stolen funds. I agreed, and Catherine set up a meeting with the Seattle Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit for the following week. Detective Lawrence Finley had been with SPD for 28 years, 17 of them in financial crimes, and he listened to my story with the kind of careful attention that made me think he'd seen this before. I showed him Dorothy's forensic report, Melissa's social media posts, the incomplete documentation she'd provided, and the medical bills that remained unpaid despite the substantial GoFundMe proceeds. He said this was a clear case of theft and fraud, that crowdfunding fraud was an emerging area they were seeing more often, and that they'd investigate immediately. He said to expect the investigation to take several weeks as they gathered evidence and built the case, but that the documentation I'd already compiled would expedite things significantly. He also warned that recovery of stolen funds was often difficult, even with a conviction, that people who commit this kind of fraud usually spend the money quickly, but that they'd do everything possible to help me recover what had been taken. The next few weeks were surreal. I was still undergoing chemo, still desperately sick, while simultaneously participating in a criminal investigation of my best friend. Melissa had no idea I'd hired investigators or contacted police, continued posting supportive messages on social media and texting me occasionally asking how I was feeling. Catherine advised me not to confront her or tip her off to the investigation, to let the police handle it, so I responded minimally, claiming I was too sick to see anyone. Meanwhile, Detective Finley's team was executing search warrants on Melissa's bank accounts, interviewing people she'd solicited donations from, and building the case. In early July, about a month after I'd first hired Catherine, Detective Finley called to say they had enough evidence to arrest Melissa and that the prosecutor's office was filing charges for wire fraud, theft in the first degree, and identity theft for using my name and story without permission to solicit funds. Melissa was arrested on July 19th at her apartment, and the news spread immediately through our social circles and her social media followers. She claimed innocence, posted a tearful video saying she was being falsely accused by someone she'd tried to help, that Adam had become paranoid and vindictive because of his illness. Some people believed her, posting supportive comments and questioning why I'd turn on someone who'd done so much for me. But Detective Finley had released a statement with enough details that many people started questioning her story, and journalists picked up the case. A local news station ran a segment about crowdfunding fraud using my case as an example, and while they didn't use my name, the details were specific enough that people connected the dots. Melissa's comment section filled with angry messages from people who donated, demanding to know where their money had gone, and threatening their own legal action. The criminal case moved forward while I continued treatment. My surgery was scheduled for August, and I still didn't have enough money to cover the deposit because so much of what had been raised was gone. Some of the original donors, once they learned about the fraud, made additional donations directly to the hospital, and my insurance company worked out a payment plan after Catherine's office sent them documentation of the theft. The surgery went well. Dr. Pierce was optimistic about my prognosis, and I started recovery while the legal process ground forward. Melissa's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor, an assistant prosecuting attorney named Diana Wolfe, who specialized in fraud cases and had been with the office for 14 years, refused to offer anything that didn't include substantial prison time. The evidence was too strong, the conduct too egregious, and there was public interest in holding her accountable as a deterrent to others who might exploit crowdfunding platforms. The trial was in October, and I had to testify about my cancer diagnosis, my trust in Melissa, the moment I discovered the theft, and the impact on my medical care and emotional well-being. It was humiliating and painful, recounting the details of my illness and betrayal in open court while Melissa sat 30 feet away, looking like I'd wronged her. Her defense attorney tried to portray me as ungrateful and paranoid, suggested that Melissa had spent some of the money on legitimate expenses related to my care, and I was misremembering or exaggerating. But Dorothy's forensic analysis was unassailable, showing exactly where every dollar had gone, and the jury wasn't buying the defense narrative. The prosecution presented Melissa's social media posts alongside bank records, showing she'd withdrawn funds within hours of posting appeals for donations, showed the designer purchases and vacation expenses, and had several donors testify about how betrayed they felt learning their money had been stolen. The jury deliberated for 7 hours and convicted Melissa on all counts. The sentencing hearing was in November, and I gave a victim impact statement describing how her theft had forced me to delay necessary medical care, how the stress of the investigation had compounded the already overwhelming stress of cancer, how the betrayal had destroyed my ability to trust people during the time I needed support most. The judge, Margaret Flynn, who'd been on the bench for 19 years, sentenced Melissa to 5 years in state prison and ordered full restitution of $116,000 plus interest and penalties. Judge Flynn said that exploiting someone's life-threatening illness for personal gain was among the most callous forms of fraud she'd encountered, that the breach of trust made it particularly heinous, and that a strong sentence was necessary both to punish the conduct and deter others. Melissa cried and apologized during the sentencing, saying she didn't know what had come over her, that she'd never meant for it to go so far, but the apology rang hollow after months of denying everything and attacking my credibility. The civil case settled shortly after the criminal conviction. Catherine filed a lawsuit seeking the stolen funds, plus damages for emotional distress and the costs of investigation and litigation. Melissa's assets were limited since she'd spent most of the money, but we were able to seize her bank accounts, garnish her future wages, and place liens on any property she might acquire. We recovered approximately $48,000 immediately and set up a garnishment structure that would theoretically recover the rest over time, though Catherine warned that enforcement would be challenging and I might never see the full amount. Still, it was something, and combined with new donations that came in after the fraud was exposed, I was able to pay off most of my medical debt and focus on recovery rather than financial crisis. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. The social fallout was extensive. Our mutual friends split, some believing I'd overreacted and destroyed Melissa's life over a misunderstanding, others horrified by what she'd done and apologizing for not seeing it sooner. Melissa's social media following evaporated once the conviction was public, her accounts filled with angry comments before she deleted them entirely. Several of her former followers contacted me directly, apologizing for initially believing her claims of false accusations and offering support. A few started their own fundraisers for my ongoing medical expenses, carefully vetting the organizers this time. The story got picked up by larger media outlets as an example of crowdfunding fraud, and I did several interviews warning others to be careful about who they trusted to manage fundraising campaigns and to verify that money was actually being used as intended. My health improved gradually through late 2023 and into 2024. The surgery had been successful, the post-surgical chemo was rough but effective, and by spring 2024, I was cancer-free according to my scans. Dr. Pierce said I'd need ongoing monitoring, and there was always risk of recurrence, but that I'd responded well to treatment and had good reason to be optimistic. The recovery was both physical and emotional, working with a therapist named Dr. Benjamin Foster, who specialized in trauma and betrayal, processing what Melissa had done, and learning to trust people again. Dr. Foster said that betrayal by someone we love and trust can be more traumatic than the original crisis they exploited, that it damages our fundamental sense of safety and our ability to be vulnerable with others. The cancer was a physical battle I could see and fight. The betrayal was a psychological wound that took longer to heal. I started a nonprofit in mid-2024 focused on crowdfunding transparency and fraud prevention, using my experience to help others avoid similar exploitation. We provide education about how to safely structure fundraising campaigns, verification services for medical fundraisers, and support for people who've been victims of crowdfunding fraud. Several other victims reached out after my story went public, people who'd trusted friends or family members to manage their medical fundraisers only to discover theft. Some had been too intimidated or sick to pursue legal action, and we connected them with attorneys and resources to hold the perpetrators accountable. The work felt redemptive, taking the worst experience of my life and using it to protect others, giving meaning to the suffering Melissa had caused. Melissa is currently serving her sentence at Washington Corrections Center for Women. She'll be eligible for parole in about 2 years, assuming good behavior, and the restitution order will follow her after release. I get quarterly updates on the garnishment progress, small amounts trickling in from her prison job wages, but I've accepted I'll probably never recover the full amount she stole. The money matters less than the accountability, the public acknowledgement that what she did was wrong and criminal. She exploited my cancer, stole from people who'd tried to help me, and nearly destroyed my ability to get life-saving treatment, all while performing the role of devoted friend for social media validation and personal profit. The legal system worked, the truth came out, and she lost everything: her freedom, her reputation, her social circle, her future career prospects. I think sometimes about that comment, at least you'll finally lose weight, and see it now as the moment the mask slipped just slightly. She wasn't actually concerned about me or my health. She was already viewing my cancer as something that benefited her, a compelling story she could exploit, and the actual physical suffering I was experiencing was just a detail in that story. The weight loss comment revealed that she saw my illness as happening to her, as something she had to deal with, rather than something I was fighting for my life against. It was the first sign that our friendship had become transactional, that she was extracting value from my crisis, rather than supporting me through it. Looking back over the 15 years of friendship, I can see patterns I missed or excused. The way she'd always made my achievements somehow about her, my promotion becoming her story, about how she'd encouraged me to take risks. The way she'd needed to be the center of attention at gatherings, getting upset if conversation focused on others too long. The way she'd volunteered to help with things but then complained about the burden, making you grateful and guilty simultaneously. None of it screamed narcissist or sociopath at the time, but in retrospect, the warning signs were there. I'd ignored them because she could be so warm and fun, because the good times were really good, and because I'd internalized the idea that real friendship meant accepting people's flaws. But there's a difference between accepting flaws and enabling exploitation, and I'd crossed that line long before the cancer diagnosis gave her an opportunity to weaponize my vulnerability. The nonprofit work has connected me with researchers studying what motivates crowdfunding fraud, and the patterns are consistent. Perpetrators are often people close to the victim who see an opportunity to exploit both the victim's crisis and public sympathy, who have narcissistic or antisocial traits that let them rationalize the theft, and who are skilled at performing care and concern publicly while acting very differently in private. Melissa fit the profile perfectly. She'd seen my cancer as an opportunity, created a compelling narrative that positioned her as the selfless caregiver, built a following around that narrative, and then monetized it by stealing donations. The cruelty wasn't a bug, it was a feature, essential to maintaining the performance while extracting maximum value. I'm 36 now, 2 years out from diagnosis, cancer-free, and rebuilding my life. I've returned to work part-time, kept the nonprofit going as a passion project, and started dating someone I met through a cancer survivor support group who understands the complicated aftermath of serious illness. I'm more cautious about trust now, quicker to spot performative caring versus genuine support, and less willing to ignore warning signs or make excuses for people's behavior. The therapist says this is healthy skepticism rather than paranoia, that having boundaries and expecting consistency between words and actions is self-protection, not cynicism. I've built a smaller circle of friends, people who've proven themselves through actions rather than declarations, and that smaller circle feels more solid than the larger network I had before. The story has a strange epilogue. About 6 months ago, I received a letter from Melissa, forwarded through Catherine's office since I'd blocked all direct contact. The letter was several pages of apology, explaining that she'd been in a dark place financially and emotionally, that she'd made terrible choices, that she'd convinced herself she was somehow entitled to the money because of all the work she was doing to manage the campaign. She said prison had given her time to reflect, that she'd been attending therapy and working on herself, that she hoped someday I might forgive her. The letter felt performative, hitting all the expected notes of remorse without actually taking full responsibility, and I didn't respond. Catherine said that was the right choice, that Melissa was likely hoping for a response that could be used to argue she'd made amends and deserved early parole. Some wounds don't heal with an apology, especially when the apology feels like just another performance. People ask sometimes if I'm angry, if I hate Melissa for what she did. The honest answer is that I've moved past anger into something colder and more permanent: indifference. She's not my friend, not my enemy, just someone who committed crimes against me and is facing the consequences. The hate and anger were exhausting emotions to carry while also fighting cancer and rebuilding my health, and I had to let them go to survive. What remains is a clear-eyed understanding of what happened, who she really was beneath the performance, and a commitment to never let someone exploit me like that again. The best revenge isn't fury or destruction. It's moving forward, building something meaningful from the ashes, and living well despite her best efforts to profit from my suffering. The nonprofit just helped its 50th victim of crowdfunding fraud secure legal representation and recover stolen funds. Each person who gets justice, each perpetrator who faces consequences, feels like winning a small battle in a larger war against exploitation and betrayal. Melissa tried to destroy me at my most vulnerable and nearly succeeded. Instead, she lost everything while I survived, recovered, and built something that helps others survive similar betrayals. That's justice. That's vindication. That's the ending she didn't script when she saw my cancer as her opportunity. She said the cancer would help me lose weight. What I actually lost was the illusion that she'd ever been a real friend. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.